Case 1. Father Gerald Robinson. On the morning of April 5th, 1980, Holy Saturday, the most sacred day before Easter in the Christian calendar, a Catholic nun was found murdered in the sacristy of the chapel at Mercy Hospital in Toledo, Ohio. Sister Margaret Ann Paul had been preparing the chapel for Easter services when someone choked her nearly to death and then stabbed her 31 times in the face, neck, and chest with a saber-like letter opener. The wounds over her heart were arranged in the shape of an inverted cross. Father Gerald Robinson, the 42-year-old chaplain who said Mass in that same chapel, had murdered her. Robinson was a priest she had worked alongside for years. Gerald Robinson was born on April 14th, 1938, in Toledo, Ohio, and raised in a devout Polish Catholic working-class family. He was educated in Catholic seminaries and ordained as a priest in 1964. By 1980, he had been serving in various parishes within the Roman Catholic Diocese of Toledo for 16 years. At the time of Sister Paul's murder, he was working as the chaplain at Mercy Hospital, where he celebrated Mass in the hospital chapel and ministered to patients and staff. He had no prior criminal record and lived on a modest diocesan priest's stipend. Colleagues described him as quiet, traditional, and unassuming, though some hospital staff found him overly strict and somewhat cold. Robinson was rigid in his adherence to liturgical tradition, easily angered by changes in church practices, and socially isolated. Sister Margaret Ann Paul was 71 years old when she was killed. She was a Catholic nun with the Sisters of Mercy and had served as the former nursing director at Mercy Hospital. She was highly respected in the community, known as a strict but deeply caring nurse and a woman who had devoted her entire life to the church. Sister Paul took care of the sacristy where Father Robinson said Mass, and she was known as a perfectionist who frequently criticized Robinson for his sloppy handling of the altar and liturgical items. On the morning of her death, she was decorating the hospital chapel in preparation for Easter Sunday services. What happened on the morning of April 5th, 1980, between 7 and 8 a.m., was an act of violence so extreme and so ritually symbolic that it would haunt investigators for more than 2 decades. Father Robinson brought his own saber-like letter opener to the chapel sacristy at Mercy Hospital. He choked Sister Margaret Ann Paul until she was near death, then stabbed her 31 times in the face, neck, and chest. The stab wounds inflicted over her heart were deliberately arranged in the shape of an inverted cross, a detail that suggested deep-seated psychological rage against the church or against female authority. After killing her, Robinson returned to his quarters, changed out of his blood-spattered vestments, and attempted to clean the murder weapon. Co-workers and fellow nuns discovered Sister Paul's body in the sacristy within an hour of the attack. The crime scene was immediately secured, and police began their investigation. The investigation began immediately, but the truth would take 24 years to surface. In 1980, police found a blood-stained altar cloth underneath Sister Paul's body that bore the distinct impression of a weapon. Investigators also found a saber-like letter opener in Father Robinson's desk at the hospital. Robinson was an immediate suspect because he had lied to investigators about his whereabouts that morning and because he possessed what appeared to be the murder weapon. However, the case stalled. The influence of the Catholic Church and the lack of advanced forensic technology in 1980 meant that Robinson was never charged. The Diocese of Toledo allowed him to continue ministering in various parishes for the next 2 decades, even though he remained a suspect in the murder of a nun. The case went cold. In 2003, a cold case unit within the Toledo Police Department reopened the investigation. Modern forensic techniques had advanced significantly in the intervening years, blood transfer analysis, a method that examines the patterns left by a bloodied weapon on fabric, was applied to the altar cloth that had been preserved as evidence. The analysis matched the impressions on the cloth to the unique shape of the letter opener found in Robinson's desk in 1980. The forensic reconstruction proved that Robinson's letter opener was the only weapon that could have made those specific blood transfer patterns. On April 23, 2004, nearly 24 years after Sister Paul's murder, Father Gerald Robinson was arrested in Toledo and charged with aggravated murder. Lucas County Prosecutor Julia Bates and Assistant Prosecutor Dean Mandros led the case. Robinson's defense attorney, John Donahue, entered a plea of not guilty. The trial began in April 2006 in Lucas County. Common Pleas Court, with Judge Thomas Osoik presiding. It was a jury trial, and the prosecution built its case methodically around the forensic evidence. The key to the conviction was proving that the specific letter opener, owned by Robinson, was the only weapon that could have created the blood impressions found on the altar cloth beneath Sister Paul's body. Expert witnesses testified about the blood transfer analysis and walked the jury through the forensic reconstruction. Other witnesses testified that Robinson and Sister Paul had despised each other, with Sister Paul frequently criticizing the priest for his careless treatment of the sacred objects in the sacristy. The defense had no credible explanation for the forensic match between the weapon and the altar cloth. On May 11, 2006, after hearing all the evidence, the jury convicted Father Gerald Robinson of murder. He stood completely stoic and emotionless as the verdict was read. Sister Paul's surviving family members expressed immense relief that justice had finally been delivered after a 26-year wait. Judge Thomas Osoik sentenced Gerald Robinson to 15 years to life in prison. Robinson showed no emotion during sentencing and offered no apology or explanation for his actions. His conviction was appealed multiple times on grounds that included the statute of limitations, the admissibility of the altar cloth evidence, and the 26-year delay between the crime and the trial. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld his conviction in every appeal. Robinson remained emotionless and unrepentant throughout the appeals process. Father Gerald Robinson died on July 4, 2014, at the age of 76, while incarcerated at the Franklin Medical Center, a prison hospital in Columbus, Ohio. He died of a heart attack. He had served approximately 8 years of his sentence and never expressed remorse for killing Sister Margaret Ann Paul. The case became the subject of extensive media coverage, including features on Dateline, NBC, and an episode of Forensic Files titled __, quote _0, __. What made this case uniquely horrific was not only the fact that a Catholic priest had murdered a Catholic nun inside a chapel sacristy on Holy Saturday, but that he had stabbed an inverted cross into her chest in what appeared to be a ritualistic desecration. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Toledo allowed Robinson to continue serving as a priest for more than 20 years after he became a suspect in the murder, a failure of institutional responsibility that enabled him to remain in positions of trust and authority. Sister Margaret Ann Paul was preparing the chapel for the resurrection of Christ when she was killed by a man who had taken vows to serve God. The 26-year gap between her murder and her killer's conviction stands as a testament to both the persistence of investigators and the protection afforded to those within powerful institutions. Case 2. Father John Bernard Feit. On the evening of April 16, 1960, a 25-year-old schoolteacher and former beauty queen named Irene Garza went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas, to attend confession on the Saturday before Easter. She never returned home. 5 days later, her body was found floating in an irrigation canal. She had been bludgeoned, raped while unconscious, and asphyxiated. The last person to see her alive was Father John Bernard Feit, a 27-year-old visiting priest who had taken her confession not in the confessional booth, but in the rectory. Feit was never arrested. The Catholic Church and local politicians actively colluded to protect him because they feared a sex scandal involving a priest would damage John F. Kennedy's campaign to become the first Catholic president of the United States. It would take 56 years for Feit to face justice. By the time he was convicted in 2017, he was 85 years old, had left the priesthood, married, raised 3 children, and lived an entire life while Irene Garza's family waited for the truth. John Bernard Feit was born in 1932 in Chicago, Illinois. He was educated in Catholic seminaries and ordained as a priest. In the spring of 1960, he was serving as a visiting priest at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas, a small city near the Mexican border. He was 27 years old, clean-cut, and trusted by the parishioners he served. What those parishioners did not know was that just weeks before Irene Garza's murder, Feit had attacked another young woman named Maria America Guerra. In a neighboring town, he had attempted to assault her in a church rectory. Rather than face serious criminal charges, Feit pleaded no contest to aggravated assault, and the church moved him to a monastery in Missouri. He was never sent to prison. Years later, Feit left the priesthood entirely, married, and had 3 children. He worked as an administrator for the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Phoenix, Arizona, and lived what appeared to be a quiet, respectable life. At 25 years old, Irene Garza was a second-grade school teacher and a former Miss All South Texas sweetheart, a beauty pageant title that reflected her standing in the community. She lived with her parents and was known as a deeply devout Catholic who took her faith seriously. On the evening of April 16, 1960, the Saturday before Easter, Irene went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church to go to confession. She trusted the sanctity of the confessional and the integrity of the priesthood. That trust cost her her life. On April 16, 1960, Irene Garza arrived at Sacred Heart Catholic Church and was met by Father John Bernard Feit. Instead of hearing her confession in the confessional booth, Feit took her to the rectory, a private area away from the public spaces of the church. There, he bludgeoned her, raped her while she was unconscious, and then suffocated or asphyxiated her. After killing her, he disposed of her body in a nearby irrigation canal. The following day, Easter Sunday, Feit celebrated Mass and heard the confessions of other parishioners as though nothing had happened. He actively participated in the church's efforts to cover up any suggestion of his involvement. 5 days after Irene disappeared, on April 21, 1960, passers-by noticed her body floating in an irrigation canal. Investigators quickly identified her and began searching for clues. A Kodak slide viewer belonging to Father Feit was found in the canal near her body. Feit was the last person known to have seen Irene alive, and the fact that he had taken her to the rectory instead of the confessional booth raised immediate suspicions. Police questioned him, but the case went nowhere. The church moved Feit to a Trappist monastery, and local authorities, under pressure from both church officials and politicians, did not pursue charges. Documents that surfaced decades later revealed the extent of the cover-up. Church officials and local political leaders actively colluded to protect Feit because 1960 was a presidential election year, and John F. Kennedy, a Catholic, was running to become the first Catholic president in American history. Church leaders feared that a sex scandal involving a priest who had raped and murdered a young woman would fuel anti-Catholic sentiment and damage Kennedy's campaign. Irene Garza's life was sacrificed to protect a political narrative. The case remained cold for more than 5 decades. Then, in the early 2000s, 2 former priests came forward with explosive testimony. Father Dale Tachenny and Father Thomas Doyle both stated that John Feit had confessed the murder to them years earlier while he was living at the Trappist monastery. The confessions were detailed and consistent. Armed with this new testimony, investigators reopened the case. On February 9, 2016, 56 years after Irene Garza's murder, John Bernard Feit was arrested at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 83 years old. He was extradited to Texas and charged with murder with malice aforethought. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Michael Garza, who bore no relation to the victim but shared her last name. The trial began in late November 2017 in Hidalgo County Courthouse. Judge Luis Singletary presided over the proceedings. It was a jury trial, and the prosecution's strategy centered on breaking down the massive institutional cover-up that had protected Feit for more than half a century. The most damaging evidence came from the testimony of the 2 former priests, Dale Tachenny and Thomas Doyle, who recounted Feit's confessions in detail. The defense had no compelling response to the testimony of fellow clergymen who had no reason to lie. The jury heard the evidence and deliberated. On December 7, 2017, they returned a guilty verdict. John Bernard Feit was convicted of murder. Because Feit was being tried under the legal standards that existed in 1960, the jury, rather than the judge, determined his sentence. They sentenced him to life in prison. Feit was 85 years old at the time of his conviction. He was transported to a Texas prison where he would spend the remainder of his life. On February 12, 2020, John Bernard Feit died in a Texas prison hospital at the age of 87. He had served less than 3 years of his sentence. The case of John Bernard Feit and Irene Garza is perhaps the most glaring example of coordinated institutional cover-up in the history of American religious crime. Church officials, local politicians, and law enforcement officers actively worked together to protect a priest who had raped and murdered a young schoolteacher, and they did so to shield a presidential campaign from scandal. Irene Garza went to church to confess her sins and was met by a predator in a Roman collar. The 56-year gap between her murder and her killer's arrest meant that Feit lived as a free man for more than half a century. He married, raised children, and built a life while Irene's family grieved and waited for justice that seemed like it would never come. When justice finally arrived, it came too late to undo the decades of institutional betrayal that had allowed a killer to walk free. Case 3, Pastor Arthur __, quote _1, Shermer. In July 2008, a United Methodist pastor in Readers, Pennsylvania, called 911 to report that his wife had been injured in a car accident. Betty Shermer, 56 years old, died shortly after arriving at the hospital. The crash appeared tragic but unremarkable, a low-speed collision with a guardrail on a rural road. Police initially treated it as an accident. 2 years later, investigators returned to the scene with luminol and found a massive trail of cleaned blood leading from the bedroom of the church parsonage to the garage. Biomechanics experts determined that a 15-mile-per-hour crash could not have caused the catastrophic skull fractures that killed Betty Shermer. She had been bludgeoned in the head with a heavy object, loaded into the car while unconscious and bleeding, and driven into a guardrail to stage an accident. The man who killed her was her husband, Pastor Arthur Burton Shermer, a respected minister who had counseled couples on the sanctity of marriage for more than 40 years. What made the case even more devastating was the discovery that Shermer had used the exact same method to murder his first wife 9 years earlier and had gotten away with it. Arthur Burton Shermer was raised in a devout Christian environment and served as a United Methodist pastor for over 4 decades. leading congregations primarily in Pennsylvania. By 2008, he was 54 years old and widely respected in his community. He counseled married couples, preached about family values, and presented himself as a model of Christian virtue. He had been married twice. His first wife, Jewel Shermer, died in 1999 at the age of 50. Shermer claimed she had fallen down the stairs of the parsonage while vacuuming. Her death was ruled accidental. In the years that followed, Shermer married Betty, and the couple lived together in the church parsonage in Readers. What his congregations did not know was that Shermer was a serial philanderer who had carried on multiple affairs with women in his congregations. He killed his wives rather than face the financial ruin and social stigma that would come with divorce in the church. Betty Shermer, 56, was a mother and a devoted pastor's wife who had supported her husband's ministry and lived with him in the isolated church parsonage. She trusted him completely. On July 15, 2008, she was living in the parsonage in Readers, Pennsylvania, unaware that her husband had decided she was an obstacle to his next affair. On July 15, 2008, Arthur Shermer bludgeoned Betty in the head with a heavy object, believed to be a crowbar, while she was in the bedroom of the parsonage. The blow caused catastrophic skull fractures. Shermer then loaded her bleeding, unconscious body into their PT Cruiser, drove the vehicle to a nearby road, and deliberately crashed it into a guardrail at low speed. He called 911 and reported that his wife had been injured in a car accident. Betty was transported to a hospital where she died from her injuries. Police initially accepted Shermer's account and treated the incident as a tragic accident. The case appeared closed. 2 years later, in 2010, a man named Joseph Musante committed suicide in Pastor Shermer's church office. Musante was distraught because Shermer had been having an affair with Musante's wife. The suicide prompted police to take a closer look at the pastor's personal life. Investigators returned to the parsonage and used luminol, a chemical that reveals the presence of blood even after it has been cleaned. The luminol revealed a massive trail of blood leading from the bedroom to the garage. The blood had been meticulously cleaned, but the chemical traces remained. Biomechanics experts examined the damage to the PT Cruiser and determined that a crash at 15 miles per hour could not have caused the skull fractures that killed Betty. The fractures were consistent with blunt force trauma from a heavy object, not from a low-speed vehicular impact. Shermer's defense attorney later claimed that the blood in the house was from an incident weeks earlier when Betty had accidentally cut herself on a piece of glass, but the claim was not credible given the volume and location of the blood. The investigation into Betty's death led police to re-examine the death of Shermer's first wife, Jewel. In 1999, Shermer had reported that Jewel had fallen down the stairs of the parsonage while vacuuming and had died from her injuries. Police had accepted his account at the time. Now, with the knowledge that Shermer had staged Betty's death to look like an accident, investigators exhumed Jewel's body. Forensic pathologists examined her remains and determined that her skull fractures were inconsistent with a fall down stairs. The injuries were consistent with being struck by a blunt object. Shermer had used the same method to kill both of his wives, and he had gotten away with murdering Jewel for 9 years. On September 13, 2010, Arthur Shermer was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and tampering with evidence in connection with Betty's death. The trial for Betty's murder began in January 2013 in Monroe County Court. Judge Margarita Patty Worthington presided. The prosecution presented the luminol evidence, the biomechanics analysis, and testimony about Shermer's pattern of extramarital affairs. The defense's claim that the blood in the parsonage came from a minor cut was rejected by the jury. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Arthur Shermer of first-degree murder. He was later also convicted of murdering Jewel. At sentencing, Judge Margarita Patty Worthington sentenced Shermer to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She told him directly that he was a narcissistic manipulator who had used the pulpit to hide his sociopathy. Shermer offered no apology and showed no remorse. The case was later featured on Dateline NBC in an episode titled The Sinister Minister and on the program 2020. At 70, Arthur Burton Shermer is incarcerated at SCI Fayette in Pennsylvania. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Joseph Musante's suicide, a tragedy born of Shermer's betrayal, inadvertently triggered the investigation that would expose 2 murders and prevent future victims. Jewel and Betty Shermer were both killed in the same parsonage, both by blunt force trauma to the head, both by a man who stood before congregations and preached about the sanctity of marriage. The parsonage, a place meant to represent faith and family, became a crime scene twice. Shermer's use of his position as a pastor to maintain his respectability while committing serial domestic murder stands as one of the most chilling examples of religious hypocrisy in American criminal history. Case 4. Pastor David Love. On March 31st, 2010, Randy Stone, a 42-year-old Marine Corps veteran and successful insurance agent, was shot multiple times in the torso at his office in Independence, Missouri. 5 days later, his funeral was held at Hope Center Church, where Randy had been a devoted member for years. Pastor David Love, Randy's close friend and spiritual mentor, delivered a passionate eulogy. He stood at the pulpit and comforted the grieving congregation, offering words of solace to Randy's widow, Teresa Stone. What the mourners did not know was that Pastor Love had shot Randy to death in that office, that he had been sleeping with Teresa for a decade, and that the couple had conspired to murder Randy so they could be together without the scandal of a divorce. Cell phone records revealed thousands of messages exchanged between the pastor, the widow, and the pastor's son, creating a digital trail that led directly to murder. David Robert Love was born in 1960 in Missouri and raised in a strictly religious Pentecostal household where his father also served as a minister. He graduated from Bible college and was ordained as a minister with the United Pentecostal Church International, though he later became independent. By 2010, Love was 50 years old and serving as the senior pastor at Hope Center Church in Independence, Missouri. He was married to Kimberly Love, and the couple had children together. Love was known in his community as a pillar of the church, a charismatic preacher who delivered fiery and emotional sermons. He had total control over the church's finances and maintained a stable income through his ministry. He had no prior criminal record, but people close to him recognized that beneath the charisma was a highly manipulative personality. Randy Stone was 42 years old when he was killed. He was a Marine Corps veteran who had served his country with honor and had built a successful independent insurance agency after leaving the military. He was married to Teresa Stone, and the couple had children. Randy was well liked in his community, known as a patriot and a dedicated father. He was also a devoted member of Hope Center Church, where Pastor David Love served as his spiritual mentor. Randy trusted Love completely. He had no idea that Love and Teresa had been carrying on a sexual affair for 10 years, or that they were plotting to kill him. The afternoon of March 31st, 2010, marked the culmination of a decade of betrayal. Pastor David Love entered Randy Stone's insurance office on the 11,600 block of East Truman Road in Independence, Missouri. Love was armed with a .40 caliber handgun that he had purchased specifically for the purpose of committing murder. He had scouted Randy's office hours and knew when Randy would be alone. Love shot Randy multiple times in the torso. Randy died at the scene. After the shooting, Love disposed of the murder weapon, which was never recovered, and deleted electronic communications between himself and Teresa Stone. He returned to Hope Center Church in time for the evening's scheduled activities, establishing what he believed was an alibi. 5 days later, Love stood before Randy's family, friends, and fellow church members, and delivered a eulogy that portrayed Randy as a beloved brother in Christ. He consoled Teresa, the woman he had been sleeping with for a decade, and led the congregation in prayer. When Teresa Stone called 911 to report that she had found Randy's body at his office, police initially treated the case as a possible robbery, but nothing had been taken from the office. There was no forced entry, and no money was missing. Detectives began looking more closely at Randy's personal relationships. A breakthrough came when investigators found a torn-up love letter from Pastor Love in Teresa's trash. The letter had been ripped into pieces, but investigators reassembled it. The letter revealed the affair. Detectives then obtained records of emails and text messages between Love and Teresa. The records showed thousands of messages exchanged over the course of years. Cell tower data placed Pastor Love in the vicinity of Randy's office at the time of the shooting. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy between the pastor and the widow. In November 2010, 8 months after Randy's murder, David Love was arrested in South Carolina, where he had fled. He was extradited to Missouri and charged with first-degree murder. Teresa Stone was also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Evidence showed she had been complicit in planning the murder, not merely covering it up afterward. Prosecutor Carrie Allen built the case methodically, presenting the love letters, the electronic communications, the cell tower evidence, and testimony about the 10-year affair. Love initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted, he changed his plea to guilty in an effort to avoid a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In November 2011, David Love was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25.5 years. At the sentencing hearing, Randy Stone's mother addressed the court. She looked directly at Pastor Love and called him the devil in a suit. Her words captured the profound betrayal felt by Randy's family and the entire congregation. A man who had stood in the pulpit and preached about faith and righteousness had murdered his closest friend to continue an adulterous affair. David Robert Love, now 66, is incarcerated at the South Central Correctional Center in Licking, Missouri. His inmate number is 1184712. He will not be eligible for parole until approximately 2035 or 2036, when he will be in his mid-70s. Teresa Stone was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy. She has since been released. The case became a subject of media coverage and true crime analysis, with particular focus on the eulogy Love delivered for the man he had murdered. Randy Stone was a Marine Corps veteran, a successful businessman, a father, and a man of faith. He trusted his pastor and his wife, and both of them conspired to kill him. The funeral at Hope Center Church, where Pastor Love stood at the pulpit and offered words of comfort, remains one of the most chilling examples of religious hypocrisy in modern American crime. Case 5. Pastor John David Terry. On June 15, 1987, firefighters responding to a blaze at the Emmanuel Church of Christ Oneness Pentecostal in Nashville, Tennessee, extinguished the flames and discovered a headless, armless corpse inside the burned building. The body was dressed in the clothing of Pastor John David Terry, and the pastor's wallet lay nearby. Investigators initially believed that Terry had died in a tragic church fire. The medical examiner quickly determined otherwise. The body had been deliberately decapitated and dismembered before the fire was set. This was not an accident. It was murder. Within days, police tracked down Pastor John David Terry, hiding in a motel under a fake name. He was alive. The body in the church belonged to James Maddox, a 32-year-old handyman and devoted church maintenance worker. Terry had lured Maddox to the church, shot him, sawed off his head and forearms to prevent identification, dressed the mutilated corpse in his own clothes, and set the church on fire in an attempt to fake his own death and escape more than $40,000 in embezzlement charges. John David Terry was 43 years old and serving as the senior pastor of the Emmanuel Church of Christ Oneness Pentecostal in Nashville, Tennessee. He was respected in the community, though some parishioners had begun to notice that he was highly controlling when it came to the church's finances. What they did not know was that Terry had embezzled over $40,000 from the church and was deeply in debt. An audit was imminent, and Terry knew that his financial crimes were about to be exposed. He had also taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy on himself and was having an affair with another woman. Terry devised a plan to escape his mounting problems. He would fake his own death, collect the insurance payout through an accomplice, and start a new life with his mistress. All he needed was a body that could pass for his own. James Maddox, 32, was a handyman who worked as the church's maintenance worker. He was a close friend of Pastor Terry and completely devoted to the church. Maddox was willing to do after-hours work at the church whenever Terry asked, and he trusted the pastor without question. He had no idea that Terry saw him as expendable. On June 15, 1987, Pastor Terry called James Maddox and asked him to come to the Emmanuel Church to help with maintenance work. Maddox arrived, expecting to assist his pastor and friend. Once Maddox was inside the church, Terry shot him to death. Terry then used a saw to cut off Maddox's head and forearms. The decapitation and removal of the hands were deliberate acts designed to prevent identification through dental records or fingerprints. Terry dressed the mutilated corpse in his own clothing and placed his own wallet near the body. He then set the church on fire, intending for investigators to find the burned remains and conclude that Pastor John David Terry had died in a tragic accident. Terry fled the scene and checked into a motel under a fake name, believing he had successfully faked his own death. The plan unraveled within days. Firefighters extinguished the church blaze and found the headless body. The medical examiner immediately recognized that the decapitation had occurred before the fire, not as a result of it. The head and hands had been removed with a cutting tool, and the precision of the cuts indicated that this was a deliberate act of dismemberment, not fire damage. The discovery that the body had been decapitated before the fire transformed the investigation from a tragic accident into a homicide. Police began searching for Pastor Terry, who was conspicuously absent. Investigators tracked his movements and found his abandoned motorcycle. Within days, they located him hiding in a motel under a false identity. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At trial, Terry's defense team attempted to claim that Maddox had attacked him and that the decapitation was a panicked response to the assault. The claim was absurd given the elaborate staging of the crime. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation. Terry's embezzlement of church funds, his mounting debts, the impending audit, the $50,000 life insurance policy, and the meticulous planning required to decapitate a body, dress it in specific clothing, and stage a fire. The jury saw through the defense's argument and convicted John David Terry of first-degree murder. He was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was later reduced on appeal to life in prison. John David Terry died in prison in 2003. James Maddox came to the Emmanuel Church believing he was helping his pastor with maintenance work. He was shot, decapitated, dismembered, dressed in another man's clothes, and left in a burning building to serve as a prop in an insurance fraud scheme. The fact that Terry saw Maddox's life as worth less than $50,000 and a fresh start speaks to a coldness that transcended ordinary greed. Maddox's trust in his pastor, his willingness to help at any hour, and his devotion to the church made him the perfect victim for a man who valued his own escape over another human being's life. The scheme failed within days, but the damage was done. A faithful church worker was murdered, decapitated, and desecrated by the man he had trusted most. Case 6. Rabbi Fred Newlander. On the evening of November 1st, 1994, Rabbi Fred Newlander called 911 to report that he had returned to his home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and found his wife, Carol, beaten and unresponsive. She had been attacked in their home and struck repeatedly with a lead pipe. Carol Newlander, 52 years old, was rushed to a hospital, where she died from her injuries. Rabbi Newlander told police that he had been at the synagogue when the attack occurred and had no idea who could have done this to his wife. The case went cold for 6 years. Then, in 2000, a man named Len Jinoff walked into a newsroom and confessed to a reporter that he had beaten Carol Newlander to death with a lead pipe, and that Rabbi Fred Newlander, one of the most influential religious leaders in the tri-state area, had paid him $30,000 to do it. Newlander had recruited Jinoff, a disturbed man he had been counseling, and manipulated him into committing murder so the rabbi could continue his affair with a younger woman without the financial and social cost of a divorce. Fred J. Newlander was 53 years old in 1994 and serving as the founding rabbi of Congregation Makor Shalom in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was one of the most prominent and influential religious figures in the region, respected for his leadership and his dedication to his congregation. He had been married to Carol for nearly 30 years, and to the outside world, they appeared to be a stable and devoted couple. What the congregation did not know was that Newlander was having an affair with a local radio host and had decided that he wanted to be with her without enduring the financial burden or the damage to his reputation that would come with a divorce. At 52, Carol Newlander was a bakery owner and had spent nearly 3 decades supporting her husband's career and ministry. She had no idea that her husband was plotting her assassination, or that he had enlisted the help of men he was supposed to be guiding and counseling. On the evening of November 1st, 1994, 2 men entered the Newlander home and beat Carol to death with a lead pipe. Newlander had recruited Len Jinoff, a man he had been counseling and who was struggling with psychological issues. Jinoff later described himself as disturbed and vulnerable, and he believed that the rabbi was a spiritual authority who had his best interests at heart. Newlander paid Jinoff $30,000 to kill Carol. Jinoff recruited an accomplice named Paul Daniels. The attack was vicious and sustained. After the murder, Rabbi Newlander, who had been at the synagogue establishing an alibi, returned home and called 911. He claimed that he had just discovered his wife and had no idea what had happened. For 6 years, the case remained unsolved. Police investigated, but without a confession or physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, the case stalled. Rabbi Newlander continued to lead his congregation and maintained his public image as a grieving widower. Then, in 2000, Len Jinoff confessed to a reporter that he had killed Carol Newlander and that the rabbi had hired him to do it. Jinoff's confession prompted investigators to reopen the case. Detectives interviewed Jinoff and Paul Daniels, both of whom provided detailed accounts of the murder and the rabbi's role in orchestrating it. The testimony from the 2 hitmen, along with evidence of Newlander's affair with the radio host, formed the basis of the prosecution's case. Rabbi Fred Newlander was arrested in 2000 and charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. His first trial, held in 2001, ended in a hung jury. Some jurors could not bring themselves to believe that a rabbi would hire someone to murder his wife. The case was retried in 2002. At the second trial, the testimony of Len Genoff and Paul Daniels was presented again, along with evidence of the affair and the financial motive. The jury convicted Fred Newlander of murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison. Fred J. Newlander died on April 17, 2024, at the age of 82, while incarcerated at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He had served approximately 22 years of his sentence. Carol Newlander was married to a man who claimed to guide others in matters of faith and morality, and he hired a vulnerable man he was counseling to beat her to death with a lead pipe so he could pursue an affair with a younger woman. The hung jury in the first trial reflected the profound cognitive dissonance that many people experienced when confronted with the idea that a rabbi could commit such an act. Len Genoff, a man who sought spiritual guidance, was manipulated into becoming a killer. The synagogue, a place meant to represent faith and community, became the site of an alibi for murder. Carol's 30-year marriage ended not in divorce, but in assassination orchestrated by the man she had supported and trusted for 3 decades. Case 7. Pastor Tracy Burleson. On the evening of May 18, 2010, Pauletta Burleson, a 56-year-old hospital employee and devoted wife of a Houston pastor, was shot once in the back of the head, outside her home on the 100 block of Green Drive. Her husband, Pastor Tracy Burleson, called 911 and claimed he had been at a convenience store when the shooting occurred. Within days, investigators uncovered the truth. Tracy Burleson, the 44-year-old pastor of First New Hope Baptist Church, had convinced his own son, William Fuller, to pull the trigger. The conspiracy was motivated by a $60,000 life insurance policy and Burleson's desire to continue an affair with a woman named Tian Palmer without the complications of a marriage. Cell phone records revealed an intense triangular pattern of communication between the pastor, his son, and their mutual mistress in the minutes leading up to Pauletta's execution. The records tracked the conspiracy from planning to murder, and William Fuller later testified against his father, stating that Tracy Burleson had manipulated him into killing his stepmother with promises of money and freedom. Tracy Bernard Burleson was born in 1965 in Texas. He was a high school graduate who became a self-styled ordained minister and, by 2010, was serving as the pastor of First New Hope Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. He was married to Pauletta Burleson, and he had a son, William Fuller, from a previous relationship. Burleson was 44 years old at the time of Pauletta's murder. He was charismatic but polarizing, and some members of his congregation had begun to notice that he seemed overly focused on money. Shortly before Pauletta's death, the church had been damaged in a suspicious fire. Burleson was suspected of involvement in the fire, but was never charged. After the fire, the church's finances collapsed, and Burleson became heavily reliant on Pauletta's income from her hospital job and the life insurance policies he had taken out on her. He was also carrying on an affair with Tian Palmer, a relationship he wanted to continue without the financial burden or social scandal of a divorce. Pauletta Burleson, 56, had worked for years as an employee at a local hospital and was the primary breadwinner for her household. She was a mother and stepmother, and she had supported Tracy's ministry with unwavering devotion. She was known in her community as a hard-working, godly woman who stood by her husband even when the church struggled financially. She had no idea that her husband and stepson were plotting to kill her. The evening of May 18, 2010, at approximately 10:15 p.m., was a calculated execution. Tracy Burleson lured Pauletta outside their home on the 100 block of Green Drive in Houston, Texas. His son, William Fuller, was hiding in the shadows. As Pauletta stepped outside, Fuller shot her once in the back of the head with a firearm. She died at the scene. After the shooting, Tracy Burleson waited several minutes before calling 911. He told dispatchers that he had been at a convenience store when the shooting occurred and had returned home to find his wife dead. The claim was a lie. The investigation exposed the conspiracy almost immediately. Police recovered the murder weapon from a crawl space near the home. Detectives obtained cell phone records for Tracy Burleson, William Fuller, and Tyon Palmer. The records revealed thousands of messages exchanged between the three over the preceding weeks and months. On the day of the murder, the records showed an intense triangular pattern of communication between the pastor, his son, and the mistress. The messages continued right up to the minute of Pauletta's death. The cell phone forensics left no doubt that the murder had been coordinated by all three. There was no evidence that Tracy Burleson had been at a convenience store at the time of the shooting. Tracy Burleson and William Fuller were both arrested within days of Pauletta's murder in May 2010. They were charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutor Carrie Allen led the case. At trial, William Fuller took the stand and testified against his father. He told the jury that Tracy Burleson had manipulated him into shooting Pauletta by promising him a share of the $60,000 life insurance policy. Fuller stated that his father had convinced him that killing Pauletta was the only way for the family to survive financially, and for Tracy to be free to pursue his relationship with Tyon Palmer. The cell phone records corroborated Fuller's testimony, showing the coordinated communication between father, son, and mistress. The evidence was overwhelming. In September 2011, Tracy Burleson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tracy Burleson, 60, is incarcerated at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Caulfield Unit. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Pauletta Burleson was the primary breadwinner of her household, a woman who worked to support her husband's ministry and provide for her family. She was shot in the back of the head by her stepson at the direction of her husband because she stood in the way of an insurance payout and an extramarital affair. Tracy Burleson convinced his own son to commit matricide, promising him money and a better future. The cell phone records that tracked the conspiracy, minute by minute, became a digital record of betrayal, showing a pastor, his son, and their shared mistress coordinating the murder of a woman whose only crime was supporting the people who killed her. Case 8. Father Ryan Scott. Father Ryan Scott was never actually a priest. He was a con man who impersonated clergy across 3 states and claimed ordination through rogue, non-canonical bishops after being expelled from several legitimate seminaries. Between 2004 and 2005, Scott operated independent traditionalist Catholic churches in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Arizona, targeting elderly parishioners and stripping them of their life savings. Scott was convicted not of physical murder, but of what prosecutors called financial homicide, the systematic destruction of a 74-year-old retired farmer named John Cesenop, who died shortly after Scott had stolen over $300,000 from him, forged deeds to his property, and isolated him completely from his family, using threats of eternal damnation. Scott is also a person of interest in the disappearances of multiple former associates, raising the possibility that his crimes extended beyond financial exploitation into violence that has never been fully accounted for. In 2021, after serving approximately 16 years of a 35-year sentence, Ryan Scott was released on parole. At 55, he is living under strict supervision in Iowa, a free man. Ryan Patrick Scott, formerly known as Randy Scott, was born in 1970 in Iowa. By the time he was 37 years old, he had built a criminal career based on religious fraud. He was expelled from several traditional Catholic seminaries and never received legitimate ordination. Instead, he claimed to have been ordained by rogue bishops operating outside the authority of the Catholic Church. These ordinations were not recognized by any legitimate religious institution, but they gave Scott the veneer of authority he needed to operate. He established independent traditionalist Catholic churches in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Arizona, presenting himself as a righteous defender of Old World Catholicism. He had a documented history of fraud and impersonating a priest. Court documents described him as having narcissistic and sociopathic tendencies. He consistently lived off donations from elderly followers, targeting those who were most vulnerable and most devoted to their faith. John Cesenop was 74 years old when he became the primary victim of Ryan Scott's exploitation. Cesenop was a retired farmer who lived alone and was deeply religious. He was experiencing cognitive decline, which made him particularly susceptible to manipulation. He became a parishioner and benefactor to Scott, believing that the man he knew as Father Ryan was his only path to salvation. Scott spent years isolating Cesenop from his family, convincing him that his relatives were threats to his soul, and that only Scott could protect him spiritually. Between 2004 and 2005 in Buchanan County, Iowa, Ryan Scott systematically stripped John Cesenop of everything he had. Scott forged legal documents to transfer ownership of Cesenop's property into his own name. He orchestrated bank transfers that moved over $300,000 from Cesenop's accounts into accounts controlled by Scott. He isolated Cesenop from his family, barring them from visiting the property and telling Cesenop that his relatives were trying to steal his soul. Recordings later recovered by police captured Scott threatening Cesenop with eternal damnation if he spoke to law enforcement or attempted to contact his family. Scott used religious terror as a weapon, convincing a cognitively declining elderly man that obedience to Scott was the only way to avoid hell. The exploitation continued for years, and by the time it was discovered, Cesenop had been financially ruined. He died shortly after his family was finally able to intervene. Scott was never convicted of directly causing Cesenop's death, but prosecutors argued that the total destruction of his finances, his property, and his dignity constituted a form of homicide that led directly to the victim's demise. The crimes came to light when Cesenop's family members, who had been barred from the property by Scott, filed a welfare check with local authorities. Police investigated and found evidence of massive financial fraud. Forged property deeds, bank transfer records showing over $300,000 moved into Scott's control, and audio recordings of Scott threatening Cesenop with damnation were all recovered. Investigative reporters at the Cedar Rapids Gazette began examining Scott's background and exposed his fraudulent history across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Arizona. The pattern that emerged was clear. Scott moved from state to state, established fake churches, targeted elderly victims, and exploited them until their resources were exhausted or authorities closed in. In 2005, Ryan Scott was arrested and charged with ongoing criminal conduct, theft by deception, and exploitation of a dependent adult. At trial, prosecutors presented the forged documents, the bank records, and the recordings. The evidence showed a man who had used religious authority to terrorize and rob a vulnerable elderly person. Scott was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years in prison. In 2021, after serving approximately 16 years of his sentence, Ryan Patrick Scott was released on parole. He is currently living under strict supervision in Iowa. He is 55 years old. John Cesenop, a 74-year-old retired farmer, was terrorized with threats of eternal damnation, stripped of over $300,000, had his property stolen through forged deeds, and was isolated from his family by a man who was never a legitimate priest. Cezinop died shortly after the exploitation was exposed, his life savings gone, his dignity destroyed, and his final years marked by fear and manipulation. Ryan Scott is free. He is also a person of interest in the disappearances of multiple former associates, suggesting that the financial crimes for which he was convicted may only be part of a larger and darker pattern. The fact that he is living under supervision in Iowa, released after serving less than half of his sentence, raises disturbing questions about accountability and the safety of future potential victims. Case 9. Youth Pastor Christopher Gaddis. On the evening of November 23, 2017, Thanksgiving Day, neighbors in Chester, Virginia, called 911 after hearing gunshots coming from a home on the 14,000 block of Dogwood Ridge Court. When police arrived, they found 3 bodies. Inside the home were 2 women. Jeanette Gaddis, 58 years old, a realtor, and her daughter Candace Kunze, 30 years old, an adult student. In the front yard was Andrew Buthorn, 36 years old, Candace's boyfriend. All 3 had been shot multiple times with a handgun. The shooter had not fled. He was still at the scene when police arrived, and he surrendered immediately. His name was Christopher Wayne Gaddis, a 58-year-old youth pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Chester, Virginia. Gaddis was Jeanette's husband and Candace's stepfather. He was known in the community as a gentle giant, a seminary-trained minister who mentored local teens and was trusted by families to guide their children in faith. He told police that he had no other choice. The 3 people he killed on Thanksgiving 2017 had been murdered because of an argument over household chores and what Gaddis described as ongoing disrespect. Christopher Wayne Gaddis was born in 1959 in Virginia. He attended seminary and was ordained as a minister. By 2017, he was 58 years old and serving as the youth pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Chester, Virginia. He had no prior criminal record and was extremely well regarded in his community. Parents trusted him to counsel their teenagers, and he was known as a mentor to young people struggling with faith and identity. Those who knew him described him as a gentle giant, a man who seemed incapable of violence. He was married to Jeanette Gaddis, a realtor, and served as a stepfather to her daughter, Candace Kunze. The 3 people Christopher Gaddis killed on Thanksgiving 2017 were his wife, his stepdaughter, and his stepdaughter's boyfriend. Jeanette Gaddis was 58 years old and worked as a realtor. Candace Kunze was 30 years old and was pursuing her education as an adult student. Andrew Buthorn was 36 years old and was in a relationship with Candace. Candace and Andrew had recently moved into the Gaddis home to save money while they worked toward financial stability. The living arrangement created tension. Gaddis resented their presence in his home and felt that they were disrespectful and unwilling to contribute to household responsibilities. The evening of November 23, 2017, approximately 11:30 p.m., marked the sudden and total collapse of a man who had spent decades projecting calm and spiritual authority. After Thanksgiving dinner, an argument erupted over household chores and perceived disrespect. The argument escalated. Gaddis retrieved a handgun and shot all 3 victims multiple times. Jeanette and Candace were found inside the home. Andrew Buthorn was found in the front yard, suggesting he may have attempted to flee or may have been shot while trying to help the others. All 3 died at the scene. Gaddis did not attempt to flee, hide the bodies, or cover up what he had done. He remained at the scene and surrendered to police when they arrived. He confessed immediately, telling officers that he had snapped during the argument and that he felt he had no other choice. Neighbors had called 911 after hearing the gunshots at approximately 11:30 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. Officers from the Chesterfield County Police Department responded and found the 3 bodies. Gaddis was cooperative and provided a full confession at the scene. There was no need for a prolonged investigation. The physical evidence, the confession, and the lack of any alternative explanation made it clear that Gaddis had committed triple murder. Christopher Gaddis was arrested on November 24th, 2017, the day after Thanksgiving, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Rather than proceed to trial, Gaddis entered a guilty plea in February 2019. His defense team argued that the killings were a crime of passion, driven by high household stress. But the argument did little to mitigate the fact that he had shot 3 people to death over domestic grievances. The prosecution emphasized that Gaddis had murdered his wife, his stepdaughter, and an unarmed guest in his home on a holiday meant to celebrate family and gratitude. Christopher Wayne Gaddis was sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 15 years. Gaddis, 66, is serving his sentence at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. The families who had entrusted their teenagers to Gaddis's spiritual guidance learned that the man they called a gentle giant had annihilated his own family on Thanksgiving. Over an argument about household chores, Jeanette Gaddis supported her husband's ministry and opened her home to her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend. Candace Kunze was building a life with Andrew Boothorn and pursuing her education. Andrew Boothorn was a guest in the home, trying to help his girlfriend and her family. All 3 were shot to death by a man who claimed he had no other choice, as though murder were the only possible response to domestic tension. The youth pastor who counseled troubled teens about patience, forgiveness, and faith executed 3 members of his own family and then surrendered, offering a confession that revealed a man who believed his own resentment justified mass murder. Case 10. Reverend William Bill Guthrie. In May 1999, Reverend William Guthrie, the 53-year-old senior minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Kearney, Nebraska, called emergency services to report that his wife, Sharon, had drowned in the bathtub of their church parsonage. He told responders that she must have slipped and fallen while bathing. Sharon Guthrie, 54 years old, and a homemaker who had been married to the Reverend for nearly 30 years, was pronounced dead at the scene. Police initially treated the death as a tragic accident. Then toxicology results came back, showing massive amounts of temazepam, a prescription sleeping pill, in Sharon's system. The dosage was far beyond what anyone would take voluntarily. Detectives returned to the parsonage and searched Reverend Guthrie's church office. On the church computer, they found recent internet searches for the exact lethal dosage of temazepam. The evidence told a clear story. Guthrie had researched how much of the drug would kill his wife, laced her chocolate milk with the pills, waited for her to lose consciousness, dragged her to the bathtub, and drowned her. His motive was an affair with a younger female parishioner. He wanted to marry his mistress without losing his prestigious ministry position or his pension, so he chose murder over divorce. William J. Guthrie was 53 years old and serving as the senior minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Kearney, Nebraska. He was a prominent and highly educated community leader, respected for his theological knowledge and his decades of service to the church. He had been married to Sharon for nearly 30 years, and to those who knew the couple, they appeared stable and devoted. What the congregation did not know was that Guthrie was having a passionate affair with a younger woman in the church and had decided that he wanted to be with her. Divorce would have meant the loss of his position, his reputation, and his pension. Murder, he calculated, would allow him to keep all 3 and be free to marry his mistress. Sharon Guthrie, 54, was a homemaker who had spent nearly 3 decades supporting her husband's ministry. She had stood beside him through church functions, community events, and the daily demands of being a minister's wife. She had no idea that her husband was planning to kill her, or that he had been researching the exact dosage of sleeping pills that would end her life. The murder Reverend William Guthrie committed in May 1999 was the product of careful planning and cold calculation. Guthrie accessed the church computer in his office and researched the lethal dosage of temazepam, a prescription sleeping medication. The searches were specific, detailed, and recent. After determining the amount needed to kill, Guthrie obtained a supply of the pills and secretly laced Sharon's chocolate milk with them. Chocolate milk was an ideal vehicle because the sweetness would mask the bitter taste of the medication. Once Sharon drank the laced milk, the massive dose of temazepam rendered her unconscious. Guthrie then dragged her to the master bathroom of the parsonage, placed her in the bathtub, and submerged her face in the water. He held her there until she drowned. After killing his wife, Guthrie left the house and went to the church to establish an alibi. He returned to the parsonage later and called emergency services, claiming that he had just discovered Sharon and that she must have slipped and fallen in the bathtub. Police initially accepted Guthrie's account and treated Sharon's death as an accidental drowning. Then the toxicology report came back. Sharon's blood contained a massive amount of temazepam, far beyond any therapeutic dose and far beyond what someone would take accidentally. The amount in her system was consistent with a deliberate overdose intended to cause death. Detectives reopened the investigation and began looking more closely at Reverend Guthrie. They obtained a warrant to search his church office and examine the computer he used for church business. The search history revealed multiple recent queries about the lethal dosage of temazepam. The searches were precise and clinical, as though the person conducting them was trying to determine the exact amount needed to kill, without leaving obvious signs of poisoning. Investigators also noted Guthrie's emotional detachment in the aftermath of Sharon's death and his immediate efforts to collect on her life insurance policy. The evidence pointed to premeditated murder. Reverend William Guthrie was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in 2000. The prosecution's strategy centered on proving that Sharon had not taken the pills voluntarily and that Guthrie had researched and planned her death with meticulous care. The church computer forensics were damning. The searches for lethal dosages of temazepam conducted on the computer in the minister's office were direct evidence of premeditation. The toxicology report proved that Sharon had been given a massive overdose. The staged drowning in the bathtub was an attempt to cover the poisoning. The defense had no credible explanation for the computer searches or the amount of temazepam in Sharon's system. The jury convicted William Guthrie of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. William J. Guthrie died in prison in 2011 after serving approximately 11 to 12 years of his sentence. Sharon Guthrie spent 30 years as a minister's wife, supporting her husband's career and standing beside him in his ministry. Her life ended in the bathtub of the church parsonage, drowned by a man who valued a younger woman and a pension more than the vows he had taken 3 decades earlier. The church computer that Reverend Guthrie used to research murder became the evidence that convicted him. The chocolate milk laced with sleeping pills was a calculated act of domestic violence disguised as care. The bathtub, a place of routine and vulnerability, became the site of Sharon's execution. Guthrie's decision to kill rather than divorce revealed a man who cared more about preserving his public image and financial security than about the life of the woman who had spent 30 years supporting him.